When I leaned around the doorway of my own kitchen and heard my daughter's cold voice drawl, "Why is she even still alive? We need the inheritance," the world slowed and my heart cracked as if someone had dropped a skillet on the tile. Yet I stayed silent because a week earlier I had watched a similar story on Grace's Stories and thought I could never be that mother. That moment hung in the air like burnt coffee, the smell of my coffee turning bitter as I realized they were talking about me, and I forced myself to breathe evenly because a 77-year-old widow from Austin has learned to swallow pain without making a sound. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe so that you're the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel, and click the like button to show other moms with grown-up kids that we're all in this together. Lucy had always been a planner, the kind who laminated grocery lists and plotted out which aisles to hit at H-E-B so Charlotte wouldn't have a tantrum. But she had a way of treating my house like an extension of her own kitchen, banging cabinets and scolding me for leaving crumbs. Maybe she thought I couldn't hear because of my age, that my hearing aids were tucked into their little case on my dresser next to the pain relief gel, but there is nothing wrong with my ears, and every word knifed through me with the clarity of a church bell on Sunday morning. I stood there gripping the Formica counter, staring at the smudge where Charlotte had pressed her sticky fingers after eating a cookie, and my mind flashed back to nights when Lucy would sit cross-legged on this same counter telling me about school as I wiped down the stove. In that flash, I saw Bradley's truck parked in the driveway like a predator waiting for prey. The big black pickup truck he loved to show off idling near my azaleas, and I remembered how his eyes lit up whenever money was mentioned. The hook sank deep when Lucy lowered her voice and laughed softly about how they could use the inheritance to pay off their Chase card and finally remodel their kitchen, complaining about the avocado green tile they hated and dreaming about granite counters as if I were already gone. I should have stormed in then and there, slammed my hand on the table, and demanded an apology. But something kept me rooted. I wanted to hear how far the rot had spread, because at this age you do not wage a war without knowing exactly where the enemy stands. I felt my blood pressure rise as Bradley joined the conversation, his baritone full of feigned concern. He said I had always been so stubborn about my will, and maybe he should step in to help me call a lawyer because there were options like a reverse mortgage, and Lucy giggled as if he were being thoughtful. They had no idea that just the day before I had sat with my neighbor's daughter, an attorney at the Travis County Courthouse, and learned that there were indeed options for a woman like me. Options that allowed me to protect myself without needing to ask their permission. At 77, I had paid off my modest ranch house outside Cedar Park decades ago, and I had a good amount of savings from when my late husband, Eddie, worked overtime at the landscaping company. I might not be wealthy, but I was comfortable enough to make their comments feel like a betrayal of a lifetime of small sacrifices. Charlotte, only 5 years old and as sweet as peach cobbler, was my sunshine. Hearing her parents talk about me like a financial burden felt like watching someone scratch a nail across her future, and that hurt more than any insult thrown my way. So I retreated to my room that evening with a heavy heart and a simmering anger, and I pulled out the notebook where I balanced my checkbook with a ballpoint pen and tallied the grocery receipts, because if they wanted to reduce me to numbers, then numbers would be the weapon I used to reclaim my dignity. The next morning I watched from the window as Lucy loaded Charlotte into their car seat and kissed her cheek, acting like the model mother, and I smiled and waved as if nothing had been broken, even though something fundamental inside me had shifted overnight. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at my oak table, the one Eddie built himself in our early years, and I wrote out a plan in neat cursive. I would gather information, double-check my legal standing, and quietly reorganize my finances before making any move that would tip my hand. My plan had 3 tracks because life is never linear. My A story would be the emotional arc, how I dealt with the heartbreak of my daughter choosing her husband over her mother. The B story would be the practical mechanics of protecting my assets. And the C story would be the relationships that either sustained or betrayed me along the way. I started by scheduling an appointment at the local branch of Wells Fargo, because I knew from my neighbor Clara's experience that a banker can be a gatekeeper or a guide. I needed to know exactly how much money I had accessible and what penalties would come with moving it. As I watched the banker, a young man no older than Lucy, click through my accounts and confirm my balances, I felt both empowered and ashamed. Empowered because I had more than I thought, and ashamed because I had once considered letting Lucy manage these accounts when my handwriting started to shake. He suggested consolidating some CDs that were set to mature in February and advised me to consider a revocable living trust, something that would let me control my assets while alive and avoid probate when I passed. But I nodded politely and told him I would think about it because I didn't want to reveal my true intentions yet. In the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel of my old SUV, hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel as the late summer heat made the leather seats uncomfortable, and I asked myself the first open question of my revenge. Should I confront them now or let the wound fester so I could cut deeper later? The question dangled like a carrot in front of a mule, pulling me forward. I decided to let them think I was ignorant for a while longer so that their greed would blossom unchecked, giving me more leverage and more justification when the time came to act. On my way home, I stopped at the pharmacy to pick up my prescriptions and saw Charlotte's favorite cereal on sale. I almost bought it and dropped it off at their house like I always did, but my hand froze mid-reach because I realized how often I had been bribing my way into my own granddaughter's life. Instead, I bought a small bottle of gold nail polish, something frivolous for myself, and as I painted my nails that evening, I decided there was nothing wrong with using a little bit of my money to rediscover pleasure. This would become a theme of my B story as I slowly spent down what they coveted. The C story began to take shape when I called my friend Maria from church. She had been like a sister to me since we were teenagers, and she listened quietly as I hinted that I was going through a family issue without divulging specifics, offering to pray with me and reminding me that I was not alone even when my own daughter turned cold. Maria suggested I join her for the senior walking group that met at the mall before opening hours, and I agreed because I needed new routines to fill the emotional void. Little did I know that the women in that group would become my informal board of advisors as I navigated the legal and emotional maze ahead. At our first walk, we circled the smooth floors of the Barton Creek Square Mall, while the smell of Cinnabon rose from the still dark kiosks, and I shared my story in broad strokes. There was immediate indignation on their faces, and one woman, a retired paralegal named Denise, advised me to document everything. Denise explained that in Texas, conversations about finances and wills can become messy in probate court. So if Lucy and Bradley attempted anything untoward later, my notes would show a pattern of manipulation. She even offered to connect me with a legal aid clinic if things escalated. It comforted me to have this circle of women around me, but part of me also felt ashamed to be airing my family's dirty laundry. Still, their support emboldened me, and I decided that the next step in my B story would be to consult a probate attorney quietly. I called the number Denise gave me and scheduled a meeting with a lawyer named Mr. Carter, a man in his 60s with kind eyes who had apparently handled many wills for folks in Austin. He invited me to his office near the county courthouse and assured me that initial consultations were free. Sitting in his office with diplomas lining the wall and a faint smell of leather-bound books, I explained the situation while he took notes. He didn't laugh or dismiss me the way I feared. Instead, he nodded, asked clarifying questions about my assets, and suggested 2 immediate actions: update my will and consider a trust. He reminded me that under Texas law I had complete control over my property while alive. Lucy had no legal claim to my assets unless I willingly added her to the deeds or accounts, and even then she would have to sign off on any sale, which made my path clear. Keep my name alone on everything, and if possible, reduce the estate's size through spending or gifting. When I told him about the conversation I overheard, his brows knit together, and he said, "Document it. The court won't read your heart, but it will read your notes." And those words became my mantra as I went home and wrote down every detail, from the time the truck arrived to the pitch of Lucy's laugh when she spoke about my death. Leaving the attorney's office, I felt the first stirring of anger giving way to something sharper: focus. I was moving along my tone arc from wounded to focused, and I knew that soon I would be in control if I remained disciplined and patient. Back at home, I pulled out an old photo album, a motif the style guide insisted on, and ran my fingers over faded pictures of Lucy in pigtails, Eddie with grease under his fingernails from the mower shop, and me in a floral dress at our wedding. These images anchored me as I prepared to become the villain in my daughter's selfish story. I decided to test Lucy's boundaries, so a week later I invited her and Bradley over for Sunday dinner and made Eddie's favorite meatloaf. I set the table with my good china and placed Charlotte's plate next to mine because I wanted to savor the time we had while also watching their interactions closely. Throughout dinner, Bradley repeatedly steered conversation toward finances, mentioning rising home prices in our neighborhood, and Lucy chimed in about how if I sold now, I could move into a smaller place and live off the profits, maybe get one of those condos near the Costco where everything was within walking distance. He even asked, halfway through a bite of mashed potatoes, if I had updated my will since Eddie passed, and when I said I had it in place and didn't see a reason to change it, he sighed dramatically and said, "Mom, we just want to make sure you're taken care of," as if I was incompetent. I kept my tone calm, practicing the calm voice described in the Avatar guidelines, and said I appreciated their concern, but I wasn't making any decisions at this time. Inside, I noted his reaction, the way his jaw tightened and his hand squeezed Lucy's knee under the table, a private message I was not meant to see. Charlotte, blissfully unaware, asked if we could make cookies after dinner like we used to, and Lucy hesitated before nodding. As we rolled dough together, Charlotte whispered, "Grandma, Mommy says you don't know how to use your phone." And though it stung, I kept my smile, tucking away each slight like a bead on a rosary. Later that evening, after they left, and the house returned to its usual quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall, I sat at my table and revised my plan. I would not just protect what I had. I would spend down a significant portion so there would be nothing left for them to grab when I was gone. This wasn't about spite for spite's sake. It was about reclaiming my agency and ensuring that Charlotte would remember me as someone who enjoyed life rather than someone who lived in fear of upsetting her daughter and son-in-law. I began by splurging on little comforts. I replaced my worn recliner with a new one from a recliner store, something that supported my back and made watching evening news more comfortable. And I ordered it through their website because the sales associate at the Austin showroom told me they'd deliver for free. I scheduled overdue appointments with my dentist and finally got that crown replaced, paying out of pocket even though my insurance covered a portion, because I didn't want Lucy or Bradley later accusing me of neglecting my health to save money. I even bought a yearly membership to the local YMCA to take water aerobics. At the same time, the B story advanced as I opened a new checking account at a local credit union under my trust's name and began moving small amounts of money weekly. This way, if Lucy ever pressured me to show her statements, she would see dwindling balances and assume I was spending frivolously. Every time I made a purchase, whether at Home Depot for new curtains or at H-E-B for organic produce I never used to buy, I wrote it down in my notebook with the date, amount, and reason so that my spending spree would be both deliberate and documented. My senior walking group cheered me on, and Denise in particular loved hearing about my little rebellions. She even suggested I book a small trip to visit my cousin in San Antonio, citing the importance of experiences over savings, and I took her advice, booking an Amtrak ticket for late October and splurging on a hotel with a Riverwalk view. During one of our mall walks, around 6 weeks after the overheard conversation, I mentioned that I was thinking of donating to a local food bank instead of leaving everything to Lucy, and Maria squeezed my hand and said, "You should give with warm hands, not cold ones," which resonated deeply. I started writing small checks to charities I cared about, the Austin Humane Society, Meals on Wheels, and the Saint, Vincent de Paul Society at my church. Each donation felt like a pebble tossed into a pond, sending ripples of generosity outward while reducing the pond Lucy wanted to drain. I also invested in myself in ways that would show a paper trail. I paid for a 4-week line dancing class. I subscribed to a streaming service so I could watch documentaries about European art I had never seen, and I bought myself a used but reliable sedan to replace my aging SUV because I wanted something easier to maintain. By the time brand mentions became necessary according to the style guide's cadence, I realized I needed to integrate them naturally. So I casually told you about my trip to Costco where I sampled fudge and debated whether to buy a giant bag of almonds, a decision that would later tie into a humorous moment with Charlotte when she tried to juggle them. Meanwhile, my relationship with Charlotte deepened. I picked her up from preschool sometimes when Lucy was running late, and we would sit on the playground bench while she told me about her day and asked why I sometimes looked sad. I told her the truth in kid terms. Grown-ups sometimes hurt each other even when they don't mean to. One rainy afternoon, She drew a picture of our house with a big sun overhead and gave it to me, saying it was because my house was cozy. I tucked that drawing into the inside cover of my notebook, a literal motif of a child's love shielding my documentation of adult greed. As the weeks rolled into autumn and the leaves on our oak trees began to turn, Lucy started calling me more often, which would have pleased me if not for the pattern. Each conversation seemed to lead back to my health, my will, or my house, and she often began sentences with, "Bradley was just thinking," as if to distance herself from the suggestions. Bradley, for his part, started dropping by unannounced. Once he showed up with a pumpkin spice latte from a coffee shop and asked me to consider refinancing with a company his friend worked at, promising low rates and cash out. I smiled and said I'd think about it, but I wrote down the date and his exact words. The emotional tension, my A story, escalated when Lucy called on a Monday and said she was enrolling Charlotte in a gymnastics class that met at the same time as our weekly cookie baking. She didn't ask if I could adjust. She simply informed me, and I could hear Bradley coaching her in the background. I felt replaced in my own family. My fear of emotional isolation crept in, but instead of begging, I calmly said, "I understand, maybe we'll find another time," then hung up and cried quietly at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea because the taste of metallic grief filled my mouth. Part of the C story is the relational thread with Charlotte's teacher, Miss Robbins. One day at pickup, she told me that Charlotte often talked about our baking and called me her best friend. Ms. Robbins smiled warmly and said I must be doing something right, and her words were like balm on my raw heart. During this time, I still played my role, inviting Lucy to run errands with me under the pretense of needing help lifting bags. We went to Target once to buy new towels, and she scoffed at my choice of bright turquoise, saying it wasn't age appropriate. I laughed it off, but noted how she always wanted to control even the smallest details. When we walked past the electronics section, she asked if I had considered upgrading my old flip phone to a smartphone and suggested a model from a cell phone provider. I told her I was happy with my prepaid phone because the battery lasted forever and I didn't need all those apps, secretly delighted to remind her that I was capable of making decisions. Meanwhile, my financial maneuvers became more sophisticated. I transferred ownership of my house into a living trust, naming the trust as the owner and myself as trustee, which meant I could live there until I died, but it would bypass probate and could be distributed to whomever I named. I didn't tell Lucy about this, though I suspected she would eventually find out. I also restructured my CDs. I cashed out a few and reinvested the funds into a short-term bond fund through Edward Jones, something recommended by Mr. Carter to provide me with steady income while reducing the large cash balance that seemed to attract my daughter's gaze like a moth to a porch light. The satisfaction of these practical steps kept me grounded as the emotional stakes continued to rise. I was still hurt, but now I had something to focus on, a series of tasks that reminded me that I was not helpless and that my life had value beyond what I could leave behind. My walking group noticed the spring in my step. Maria teased me about my new shoes, which I bought at a department store after using a coupon I found in the mail, and we laughed over a pretzel from a pretzel kiosk as if we were teenagers again. Laughter, I realized, was part of revenge, too, because it stole power from those who wanted me diminished. Another hook emerged when, while cleaning out a cabinet, I found an old letter from Eddie. He had written it before his heart surgery in 1998, just in case something went wrong. In the letter, he told me to look out for Lucy, but also to look out for myself, to never let guilt make decisions for me. Reading those words, I felt Eddie's presence guiding my plan. That letter became my secret talisman. I carried it in my purse and sometimes read it before bed, and it strengthened my resolve not to cave when Lucy called again, this time suggesting we meet with a financial advisor she knew from Bradley's work at AT&T. I politely declined and said I was comfortable with my own arrangements. Bradley, sensing my resistance, began to get more aggressive. He once raised his voice during a phone call, saying I was being paranoid and that if I kept spending money, I would end up destitute. And then where would I turn? The implication was clear to them. I calmly responded that my finances were my business, and if he wanted to worry about something, he could worry about their own credit card debt. There was a pause, then a click, as he hung up without saying goodbye. And I wrote down the time, the words, and my own racing heartbeat. Days later, I received a letter in the mail from a law firm I didn't recognize. It said they represented Lucy and Bradley and requested information on my will and estate planning, claiming they wanted to ensure proper planning for my future care. My hands trembled as I read the letter, but then anger settled in like a heavy quilt. I took the letter to Mr. Carter, and he shook his head in disbelief. He drafted a reply on my behalf stating that my estate planning was in order and that any further inquiries would be considered harassment. He also advised me to consider a restraining order if they continued to pressure me, and although I didn't think it would come to that, the suggestion was both sobering and empowering. This legal twist escalated the B story and forced me to accelerate my spending plan. I decided to give $10,000 to the church building fund, something I had wanted to do for years but kept delaying because of Lucy's constant hints about inheritance. Writing that check felt like a final goodbye to the idea of pleasing her. At the same time, I invited Charlotte and Ms. Robbins over for a craft afternoon. We made paper turkeys for Thanksgiving, and she sang songs she had learned in class. I savored every minute, aware that Lucy could change the schedule again at any moment, and I made sure to send Charlotte home with a bag of homemade cookies and a hug that lingered. Lucy called that night, furious, saying I had no right to involve Ms. Robbins without her permission. I reminded her that I was Charlotte's grandmother and had every right to host her, and that Ms. Robbins was there for supervision. Lucy threatened to limit my visits if I didn't run things by her first. I held the phone away from my ear, took a deep breath, and then said in a measured tone, "Lucy, you are an adult and a mother, but I am still your mother. I'm not asking you for permission to love my granddaughter. If you choose to restrict my time with her, then that is on you." There was silence on the line, broken only by Bradley muttering something in the background, and then she said she needed time to think. I realized then that my calm boundary setting, part of the A story, was as critical as my financial maneuvering. I wasn't just spending money, I was reclaiming respect. The tension built into a cliffhanger when Thanksgiving arrived. Lucy invited me to their house, but I could tell by her tone that she expected me to decline. Instead, I accepted and arrived with a pecan pie and a smile, determined to maintain grace while keeping my plan hidden. Dinner was awkward. Bradley carved the turkey like a surgeon while Lucy fussed over side dishes. The smell of rosemary and stuffing filled the air, but there was a chill between us. After dessert, Bradley pulled out a document and said, "We had our attorney draw up a power of attorney. If you sign this, we can help manage things if anything happens." I nearly choked on my coffee. I set the mug down slowly and said, "I'm not signing anything today," watching Lucy's face flush. They tried to guilt me, saying I owed it to them after all they had done. My mind flashed back to nights I rocked Lucy to sleep while Eddie worked double shifts, to hospital bills paid off penny by penny. I reminded myself of my core values: dignity, fairness, self-reliance, truth, and maternal loyalty. I left their house that night shaking, but I didn't cry. I drove to the gas station and filled up my tank at Chevron, feeling the pump vibrate in my hand, and I realized the smell of gasoline had always reminded me of independence, because Eddie taught me to pump my own gas when we first got married in 1972. That night I wrote down every detail of the dinner, the date, the time, the conversation, and I slipped into bed with the knowledge that the war had become an open conflict. Now my plan moved into its next phase, not only spending my money, but ensuring that Lucy and Bradley saw me spending it, giving them enough rope to hang themselves with their greed. I scheduled a consultation with a real estate agent about selling my house, not because I intended to move, but because I wanted to know its market value. The agent toured my home, complimented my well-kept lawn, and estimated it at $420,000, a number that made me dizzy and delighted because Eddie and I had bought it for $52,000 in 1985. I told Lucy, casually, that I was thinking about moving to a senior community with activities and a shuttle. She immediately perked up and offered to help me tour facilities. I agreed, not because I needed her advice, but because I wanted her to believe that I was considering cashing out. During our tour of a community near Lake Austin, she kept saying how nice it would be if I sold my house and pocketed the money, repeating numbers like $420,000 as if the figure already belonged in her checking account. The sales rep mentioned an on-site clinic and a dining hall that served meals like the ones at a family-style Italian restaurant, and Lucy gushed like we were at a 5-star resort. After the tour, we stopped at Panera for lunch, and Lucy started drawing numbers on a napkin, calculating how much I could get after taxes and how I could gift some to her for Charlotte's college fund. I watched the numbers swirl as if I were drowning, but then I smiled and said I would think about it. At the table next to us, a pair of retirees discussed their upcoming trip to the Grand Canyon, and the joy in their voices reminded me that I didn't have to shrink to make Lucy comfortable. Over the next weeks, I began spending more boldly. I booked a Caribbean cruise with a friend from church for the spring. I prepaid for a year of housekeeping services through a local company, and I finally replaced my decades-old HVAC unit, hiring technicians from a well-known company who installed an energy-efficient system and offered me a discount because I was a member of a senior discount program. Brand mention number 2 arrived when I decided to buy a new mattress at a mattress store. The salesman gave me a great deal on a memory foam model, and as we loaded it into my used sedan, he mentioned his grandmother and how she insisted on paying cash for everything. His casual comment felt like a wink from the universe, reminding me that independence comes in many forms. These purchases were not reckless. Each expense was planned and purposeful, and I kept receipts in a file folder labeled Inheritance, a bit of dark humor that only I understood. If Lucy ever saw it, She would think it was an accounting ledger, not a ledger of my liberation. As the calendar turned to December, holiday decorations went up around town, and I felt both nostalgic and anxious. I had always hosted Christmas at my house, but this year Lucy insisted we gather at her place because she didn't trust me to manage the cooking. I agreed, wanting to see how far she would push. On Christmas Eve, I drove to their house with wrapped gifts for Charlotte, including a set of watercolor paints and a book about famous female artists. Inside, the trees sparkled with lights and the smell of pine filled the air. We exchanged pleasantries, but the tension was thick enough to slice with a carving knife. After dinner, Lucy handed me an envelope and said, "This is a list of things Bradley and I think you should consider next year," as if I were an employee receiving a performance review. The list included selling my car, signing a joint account, and moving to the senior community. I scanned the paper and felt my jaw clench, but I smiled and said I'd consider it because I wanted to keep them complacent for a little longer. Later in my car, I cried. The tears were not just for myself, but for the little girl Lucy had been, the one who used to leave me Mother's Day cards under my pillow. How did we get here? That question haunted me, and it's a hook I'm leaving unresolved for now, because even after everything, I don't fully understand the transformation. New Year's came and went. I celebrated quietly with Maria and Denise, eating black-eyed peas for good luck and watching the Times Square ball drop on TV. We raised glasses of sparkling cider and toasted to fresh starts. I resolved that this would be the year I enacted the final stage of my plan. First, I met with Mr. Carter again and updated my will. I removed Lucy as my primary beneficiary and replaced her with 2 charities and a trust for Charlotte's education that would be managed by a neutral third party until she turned 25. Mr. Carter explained that under Texas law, Lucy couldn't contest a properly executed will without cause, and if she tried, the no contest clause would disinherit her completely. The sense of control I felt leaving his office cannot be overstated. I sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, and whispered thank you to Eddie and to the God I believe watches over widows and grandmothers. I was moving from focus to in control, the final stage of my tone arc, and it felt like stepping onto solid ground after months of walking on shifting sand. I continued spending. I paid off the rest of my mortgage early, even though it made little financial sense because the money would be mine to spend rather than counted among my assets. I bought new kitchen appliances from a hardware store and had them installed, delighting in the way the new refrigerator hummed quietly compared to the old one that rattled. I even bought a set of high-end knives because cooking should be pleasurable. Lucy noticed the changes. She made snide comments about my midlife crisis, even though I was long past midlife. She told me I was being irresponsible. I told her I was living my life. We were at an impasse, and every conversation felt like a tug of war over my autonomy. Then came the phone call that changed everything. In March, I was on my way home from the YMCA when my phone rang. It was the bank's fraud department from Chase alerting me that someone had attempted to open a line of credit in my name. The representative, a calm voice from a call center, asked if I had authorized the application. I hadn't. I told them no and asked for details. They said the application had been made online with all my correct personal information. I froze, realizing that someone close to me must have tried. I thought of Lucy. I thought of Bradley, The idea that they would forge my name to get at my money shook me to my core. I drove straight to the bank branch and sat down with the manager. We filed a fraud report and placed additional security on my accounts, including requiring my physical presence for any changes. I left with a folder of documents and a heavy heart. The betrayal was now in black and white, not just in overheard whispers. When I confronted Lucy, she denied knowing anything. Bradley stayed silent. Their defensiveness only deepened my suspicion. I told them I had filed a police report and that there would be consequences. For the first time, I saw fear in Lucy's eyes, and I felt both vindicated and sickened. The B story now intersected with the law. I was asked to provide copies of emails and phone logs. I spent hours at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee, highlighting dates and times. Denise helped me compile everything. Her paralegal skills were invaluable. I felt supported and less alone. During this chaotic time, the C story blossomed in unexpected ways. Ms. Robbins invited me to speak to Charlotte's class about gardening, a hobby Eddie and I shared. I hesitated, fearing Lucy's reaction, but I went anyway. The children listened with wide eyes as I talked about seeds and patience. Charlotte beamed, proud of her grandma. After class, Ms. Robbins hugged me and whispered, "You are stronger than you know." Those words carried me through the days that followed. The police investigation revealed that the IP address used to apply for the credit line came from Bradley's office computer. Confronted with evidence, he admitted to just exploring options and claimed he never submitted the application, that it must have been an error. The officer wasn't amused and filed a warning. Lucy was furious with him for getting caught. I overheard them arguing from the porch when I went to drop off Charlotte's forgotten lunch. She hissed that he was ruining everything. He snapped that it was her idea. Their alliance cracked, a small fracture that made me realize their greed was not unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, they kept their distance. Bradley stopped calling. Lucy texted occasionally, but avoided in-person visits. I missed Charlotte terribly, but tried to fill my days with activities. I started volunteering at the food pantry I had donated to, stocking shelves and handing out produce. The smell of fresh bread and the smiles of grateful people reminded me that money is most meaningful when it feeds someone. Brand mention number 3 came when I had to replace my water heater. I called a local plumber recommended by my neighbor, and he insisted on installing a reliable water heater he said was reliable. I paid with my credit card from my credit card company and wrote the amount in my notebook, another log of spending that served both comfort and strategy. As spring turned to summer, my financial balance sheet looked very different than it had a year before. My savings were lower, but my life felt richer. I had visited my cousin in San Antonio, eaten empanadas along the River Walk, and danced under fairy lights at a community center with other seniors. I had discovered that revenge can taste like freedom when it's rooted in self-care. Lucy began calling again, likely because she needed help with childcare when Charlotte's summer camp fell through. I agreed to watch Charlotte on Mondays and Wednesdays, and for a brief period the C story felt like a return to normal. Charlotte and I made lemonade, planted herbs in small pots, and read books under the ceiling fan's gentle breeze. One afternoon, while we were drawing with chalk on the driveway, Charlotte looked up and said, "Mommy says you're spending all our money." And the innocence in her voice cut me. I responded softly, "I'm spending my money on my life, sweetheart, and that's okay." And we went back to drawing, but the moment etched itself into my heart. It became clear that Lucy was poisoning Charlotte's perception of me, and this triggered my deepest fear. Being discarded by my family, I realized my revenge would not just be financial, it would also involve creating a legacy of truth that Charlotte could one day read. So I began writing a long letter to Charlotte, one she would receive when she was old enough to understand. In it, I described my life, my love for her, and the events that led to our estrangement. I wrote about Eddie's kindness, about Lucy's generosity when she was younger, about the smell of rain on our driveway, and about the day I heard her mother talk about me like an item on a to-do list. This letter became my emotional insurance policy. It was part confession, part explanation, and part love letter. I wrote late into the night, my hand cramping, tears blurring the ink. I sealed each completed page in a plastic sleeve and placed it in a binder labeled, "For Charlotte, love always, Grandma." The summer heat in Austin reached triple digits, and my new HVAC hummed reliably. I spent afternoons at the public library, reading and writing. I learned about Texas probate law in more detail, about cases where greedy relatives contested wills. I felt grateful to Mr. Carter and to the planning I had done early on. Brand mention number 4 arrived when I treated myself and Maria to pedicures at a local salon that used salon-quality nail polish. As we soaked our feet and chatted about grandchildren and recipes, I realized that small luxuries like this were not just indulgences, but investments in joy, something Lucy could not take from me. Throughout July and August, Lucy's attitude shifted. She became sugary sweet on the phone, asking about my health, offering to bring groceries and complimenting my new curtains. I saw through it. I suspected she had realized my assets were dwindling and that her plan was crumbling. I played along, never letting her see my hand. Then in early September, she called with big news. They were in financial trouble because Bradley had lost his job at AT&T after the fraud warning triggered an internal investigation. He was facing potential charges. They were behind on their mortgage and credit cards. She asked if she and Charlotte could move in with me temporarily while they got back on their feet. My mind raced. Here was the moment my actions had been leading to. I could say yes and allow them to infiltrate my home, or I could enforce a boundary. I asked for a day to think. After hanging up, I sat on my porch and listened to the cicadas hum, the smell of freshly cut grass hanging in the air, and I thought about Eddie's letter and my own needs. I decided to let them come, but on my terms. I called Mr. Carter and asked what protections I needed if they moved in. He recommended a rental agreement outlining rent, length of stay, and responsibilities to prevent them from claiming residency rights or refusing to leave. He also suggested I record all conversations related to finances within legal limits and have a witness whenever possible. When I told Lucy about the rental agreement, she balked. She said family doesn't charge family. I replied that family doesn't commit fraud or pressure their elders to sign away power of attorney. She went quiet, then said they would sign whatever I wanted. Desperation dripped from her voice. They moved in mid-September. I cleared out the guest room, placed my valuables in a safety deposit box at the credit union, and installed a simple doorbell camera that the plumber had recommended. I wasn't spying, I was documenting. The smell of boxes and Bradley's cheap cologne filled my hallways. But I told myself this was the final act. The first week was tense but civil. I wrote down everything. They paid the modest rent I asked for, which I donated anonymously to the food pantry. Charlotte was thrilled to be living with me and spent evenings coloring at the kitchen table while Lucy cooked dinner under my watchful eye. But cracks appeared quickly. Bradley complained about the rent, about the food I bought, about the chores. He left dishes in the sink and rolled his eyes when I asked him to take out the trash. Lucy tried to mediate, but her patience wore thin. One night I overheard them arguing about my hidden money and whether they could convince me to move to a nursing home sooner rather than later. The open loop tightened when I came home one afternoon and found Bradley rummaging through my filing cabinet. I cleared my throat loudly. He jumped and mumbled that he was looking for a stamp. I didn't believe him. I called Lucy into the room, explained what I saw, and asked Bradley to leave. He refused, saying he lived here now. I called the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes. I explained the situation calmly, showed them the rental agreement, and told them I wanted Bradley removed from my home for violating my privacy. He argued, but the officers escorted him out. Lucy packed their things that night, tears streaming down her face as Charlotte clung to me. I hugged my granddaughter tightly, whispering that I loved her, while telling Lucy she could come back to visit alone any time. Bradley slammed the front door. The sound echoed through the house like a gavel. I sat on the couch, shaking but resolute. I had executed the plan. I had given them enough rope. They had hung themselves, and now my home was mine again, my finances secure, my dignity intact. In the aftermath, Lucy sent a flurry of texts, alternately apologizing and blaming me. I didn't respond. I forwarded the messages to Mr. Carter. He suggested I block her number for a time to protect my peace. I did. The silence was both lonely and liberating. I missed Charlotte. I grieved the relationship I had lost. But I also felt a weight lifted. Brand mention number 5 came when I took myself to a craft store and bought supplies to start scrapbooking my letter to Charlotte. As I trimmed photos and glued them onto colorful pages, I felt like I was weaving together the threads of my life, creating a tangible legacy that would tell my side of the story long after I was gone. Months passed. My bank statements reflected the many ways I had chosen to invest in myself. My will sat in Mr. Carter's safe with the trust documents. The letter to Charlotte grew thicker. My notebook of expenses became a chronicle of autonomy. I found a rhythm of volunteer work, senior classes, and quiet mornings on the porch. Lucy eventually reached out with a simple message. "Mom, can we talk?" I met her at a neutral location, the cafe inside a Barnes & Noble, because I didn't want either of us to be on home turf. She arrived looking tired, her hair pulled back, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She ordered a chamomile tea and sat opposite me. She apologized, not with excuses, but with genuine regret. She said she had been blinded by fear of financial insecurity and by Bradley's pressure. She confessed that hearing me say no at Thanksgiving made her feel rejected and triggered old resentments. She admitted she didn't realize the depth of her cruelty until she saw the police escort her husband out of my house. I listened, nodding occasionally. I asked if she understood why I had to protect myself. She said she did. She asked about the will. I told her the truth. She would not inherit anything, but Charlotte would be provided for through a trust. Her face fell, but she nodded, saying she didn't deserve it. I agreed silently. We talked about boundaries, about respect, about the weather. We didn't hug, but there was a softness between us that hadn't been there in a long time. I left the bookstore with mixed emotions. I knew we couldn't rewind the past, but maybe we could repair enough for future interactions to be civil. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. I had already executed it. Now I wanted peace. Brand mention number 6 appeared when on my way home. I stopped at CVS to pick up a prescription and ran into Ms. Robbins. She asked how I was. I smiled and told her I was doing better. She invited me to read to the class again. I accepted, knowing that my connection to Charlotte would continue through the community we shared, rather than through Lucy's permission. In late November, a year after hearing the fateful words that sparked this journey, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and looked around my house. New appliances, a comfortable chair, pictures of my late husband and of Charlotte's drawings, the smell of cinnamon from the apple crisp in the oven. I felt content. My bank account was lower, but my life was richer. The numbers that once represented potential conflict now represented experiences, charities supported, friendships deepened, and a legacy protected. I had spent every penny of the inheritance they coveted, not wastefully but intentionally, transforming money into moments and protection. In the quiet months that followed, after the drama subsided and the phone stopped buzzing with demands, I felt something like an ache settle into my bones, and I realized that resentment is a heavy coat to wear in the Texas heat. So I scheduled a counseling appointment at the community clinic and sat in a room with beige walls and the faint hum of a white noise machine, while a therapist listened to me describe the smell of my mother's kitchen, the weight of Eddie's work boots, and the day my own daughter reduced me to a balance sheet. The therapist, a gentle woman with glasses that magnified her empathetic eyes, asked me to close my eyes and imagine a time before the betrayal when I felt safe, and I thought of nights on our back porch watching fireflies dance while Lucy laughed in her pajamas, a memory so vivid that tears slipped down my face and my hands shook as I admitted how much I missed that girl and how betrayed I felt by the woman she became. Counseling didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me tools. I learned to breathe through the anger, to write letters I would never send, and to speak my truth without needing someone else to validate it. After one session, I came home and sat at my table with my notebook and wrote a list of every instance of generosity I'd shown Lucy over the years, the times I covered her rent, the nights I drove across town when Charlotte was sick, the hours I spent sewing her wedding dress, so that I could remind myself that my love had been tangible and deserved respect. One of the therapist's suggestions was to create new memories to replace painful ones, so I signed up for a quilting class at the local senior center, a place that smelled faintly of lavender and starch. And as I learned to piece together fabrics in careful patterns, I found the act meditative. One afternoon, the woman across the table, a retired high school teacher named Caroline, shared that her son had also cut her off after she refused to co-sign on a loan, and we bonded over the absurdity of being punished for protecting ourselves. In that quilting class, between sips of lukewarm coffee and the hum of sewing machines, I discovered that my story was not unique. Nearly every woman in that room had a tale of adult children who took without gratitude and blamed without mercy, and hearing their stories made mine feel both less isolating and more part of a larger tapestry of generational entitlement gone wrong. My therapist also encouraged me to practice forgiveness, not to forget or excuse the harm, but to release my grip on the narrative that defined me as a victim. She said forgiveness was like unclenching a fist that had been tight for so long that the nails left marks on the palm. And I realized that letting go didn't mean inviting Lucy back into my bank account. It meant giving myself permission to sleep without replaying every conversation. During this time, I invested in something intangible yet invaluable, hearing aids. I had resisted for years, telling myself I was managing fine, but after missing too many soft words from Charlotte, I finally made an appointment with an audiologist and was fitted with sleek devices that tucked behind my ears. The first time I wore them, I heard the neighbors' wind chimes clearly and the subtle rustle of leaves, and I cried in my car because it felt like I had been invited back into a world of subtle sounds, just in time to hear my granddaughter's giggles more clearly. With better hearing came new experiences. I began listening to audiobooks borrowed from the library, immersing myself in novels and memoirs that reminded me that life is full of chapters. One book was about a woman who reinvented herself after her children moved away, and another was a memoir by a journalist who traveled across the United States interviewing seniors about their second acts. I took notes, circling ideas about painting, traveling, and writing my own story beyond the confines of betrayal. Inspired by those stories, I adopted a dog from the Austin Humane Society, a scrappy terrier mix with big eyes and a crooked tail, whom I named Patchwork because of my quilting hobby. The shelter worker told me he had been surrendered by an older couple moving into assisted living, and I felt a kinship. Bringing him home filled my house with new energy. His paws clicked on the hardwood floors, his bark echoed down the hallway, and his warm body curled against my legs at night, like a reassurance that I was still needed and loved unconditionally. Patchwork also served as a daily reminder to get outside. We walked through my neighborhood every morning, and I chatted with neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. One man, a Vietnam veteran named Harold, stopped to admire Patchwork and ended up sharing his own story of a daughter who sued him over the proceeds of a farm sale. We laughed ruefully at how children can surprise you, and as the sun warmed our backs, I realized that healing happens in small exchanges on quiet streets as much as in grand confrontations. On days when the weather cooperated, I drove Patchwork to Zilker Park and sat on a bench with a thermos of iced tea, watching joggers and families pass by. One afternoon, a mother chasing her toddler tripped and fell, spilling her diaper bag. I helped her gather crayons and crackers, and she thanked me with a frazzled smile. I wondered if Lucy ever felt like that, overwhelmed and in need of a steady hand. But then I reminded myself that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice, and that boundaries can coexist with compassion. As spring bloomed, blue bonnets dotted the sides of highways, and I decided to take a day trip to the hill country to see them. I drove with Patchwork sleeping in the passenger seat, the windows rolled down just enough to let in the scent of wildflowers and fresh soil. I stopped at a roadside stand to buy honey and chatted with the owner, who told me he had sold his farm to his son last year, but kept a life estate so he could still live on the land. His decision reminded me of the legal tools I'd learned about and made me smile at the thought of rural solutions to urban problems. At the stand, I met a woman named Janine, an artist from Fredericksburg who was sketching the flowers. We struck up a conversation, and she mentioned that she was creating a series on mothers and daughters. I laughed and told her she might not want to hear my story. She insisted she did. So we exchanged numbers, and weeks later she invited me to her studio, where I posed for her among canvases smelling of turpentine. The portrait she painted captured the lines on my face not as scars but as stories, and hanging it in my living room became an act of reclaiming my own image. These experiences enriched my sea story, the relationships that reflected the stakes. While Lucy drifted on the periphery, my community deepened. At church, Father Miguel delivered a sermon about prodigal sons and daughters, and his words about the parent who waits and the child who returns pierced me. After service, he found me lighting a candle and said quietly that forgiveness is a choice you make for yourself, not a pass you give to someone else. His presence, the smell of incense, and the flicker of candles created a moment of peace amid the emotional churn. I also invested in practicalities that often get overlooked until it's too late. I met with a funeral planner and prepaid for my own arrangements, choosing a simple service with hymns Eddie loved, and specifying that any donations be made to the food pantry. Some might think planning your funeral is morbid, but I saw it as the ultimate gift of not burdening Lucy or Charlotte with decisions. The planner complimented my thoroughness and said most people wait until a crisis, which seemed to be a theme in this journey. In talking to the planner, I was reminded of my own mother, who had left us with a stack of unpaid bills and no instructions. The chaos and arguments that ensued between my siblings scarred me. I vowed then never to do that to my family. Even though Lucy had disappointed me, I still didn't want to leave a mess for her to clean up. My revenge was measured, not vindictive. It was about control and calm endings. On a practical note, I spent time going through my house room by room, sorting items into boxes marked keep, donate, and trash. In the attic, I found boxes of Lucy's childhood books and toys that I had saved. I dusted off Where the Red Fern Grows and the Babysitter's Club and laughed at the neon scrunchies and friendship bracelets. I decided to create a memory box for Charlotte, filled with her mother's childhood treasures and stories about when Lucy used to sneak cookies before dinner. I hoped that one day Charlotte would appreciate that her grandma saw her mother as more than her worst mistakes. I also discovered a shoebox filled with letters Eddie and I wrote to each other when he worked out of town in the early years of our marriage. Reading his neat handwriting, his jokes about co-workers, and his sweet reassurances that he would be home soon made him feel alive again. I spent an evening reading them aloud to Patchwork, pausing to laugh and wipe tears. Those letters reminded me that my marriage had been a partnership built on respect and love, and they strengthened my resolve not to let my daughter's choices rewrite the narrative of my life. Midway through the year, I decided to trace our family's genealogy using an online service. I spit into a tube, mailed it off, and waited. When the results returned, I discovered cousins in Louisiana and Alabama I never knew existed. Connecting with them via letters and phone calls gave me a broader sense of belonging. One cousin, Etta, shared that she had also cut off a son after he stole from her. We commiserated and shared recipes. She sent me her gumbo recipe, and I sent her my pecan pie instructions. Family, I realized, is both blood and choice. At the senior center, I joined a writing workshop. Each week, we brought pieces to read aloud. I read an excerpt from the letter to Charlotte. My hands trembled, but the room was silent, eyes watery. One woman said, "Your honesty is a gift," and another asked if I had considered publishing my story. I laughed and said I was content to share it with those who needed to hear it. Still, the idea of my experiences helping others warmed me. Lucy and I began to exchange occasional texts about neutral topics, recipes, weather, photos of Charlotte's art, and although our relationship remained tentative, I noticed a shift. She no longer asked about money. Instead, she asked about me. Once she sent a picture of Charlotte wearing a dress I had bought months ago and said, "She misses you." I stared at the screen, tears welling, and replied, "I miss her too." At one point, Lucy suggested that the three of us attend a family mediation session. At first, I bristled, suspecting an ambush, but my therapist reminded me that mediation could provide structure and a neutral space to air grievances. We met at a small office with a mediator who laid out ground rules. No interrupting, speak from your own feelings, no discussing inheritance. Over 2 hours, we talked about the hurt, the expectations, and the miscommunications. I told Lucy that her comment about me being alive for my money had felt like a bullet. She cried and said she never meant for me to hear it and had been venting. I told her venting has consequences. During mediation, Bradley wasn't present. Lucy told me they were divorcing. His repeated schemes, his job loss, and his unwillingness to get help for his gambling debt had been the final straw. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. I also felt relief that his influence would wane. We agreed to rebuild slowly and to keep money out of our conversations. We ended the session with a tentative plan for a Saturday picnic at a public park with Charlotte. The picnic day arrived sunny and mild. I packed fried chicken and potato salad. Lucy brought watermelon and Charlotte's new soccer ball. We laid a blanket on the grass under a live oak tree, and the afternoon unfolded with laughter and small talk. Charlotte, now 6, showed me her cartwheel and asked if I would teach her to sew. Lucy watched with a mix of nostalgia and regret. I glimpsed the girl she had been when we sewed her Halloween costume together on this very grass 25 years ago. That picnic didn't erase the past, but it created a new memory. As the sun set and the cicadas began their song, we packed up and Lucy hugged me briefly. Her arms around me felt both familiar and foreign. She whispered, "I'm sorry," and I whispered, "Me too." And that was enough for that day. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a series of small choices, each one building on the last. I also continued volunteering at the food pantry. One Thursday, a woman named Cheryl came in looking frantic. She explained that her adult son had taken her car without permission, racked up tickets, and then yelled at her for being upset. I empathized deeply. We loaded her cart with canned goods and fresh produce, and as she wiped her eyes, she said, "I don't know what I'd do without this place." I replied that helping each other is what keeps us afloat when family lets us down. At the YMCA, I advanced from water aerobics to a gentle yoga class. At first, I felt self-conscious, but the instructor, a patient man with a soothing voice, guided us through poses that stretched muscles I didn't know were tight. During Savasana, lying still with Patchwork sleeping at my feet on the mat, I learned to calm the swirl of thoughts and to let my breath anchor me. This practice spilled into my daily life, reminding me to pause before responding to Lucy's texts or my own fears. Summer turned to fall again, and the anniversary of Eddie's passing approached. I visited his grave with fresh flowers and a folding chair. I sat and told him about the year, the betrayal, the revenge, the healing. I told him about Patchwork, the quilting class, the mediation. I asked aloud if he'd be proud of me. A breeze rustled through the cypress trees and a cardinal landed nearby. I took it as a sign that he was listening, and I smiled through tears. During this visit, I also noticed a woman crying at a nearby grave. She looked about my age and wore a cardigan despite the heat. I approached and offered a tissue. She told me her name was Nora and that she was visiting her husband's grave on their anniversary. We shared stories of marriages forged in the 70s, of children who had drifted away, and of the relief of talking to someone who understands. We exchanged numbers and later met for coffee, adding another thread to my supportive community. As my social circle grew, I found myself spending less time at home and more time in the world. I attended a lecture at the public library about Texas history, joined a gardening club that met at the community garden, and even took a weekend trip to Waco with Maria to tour the famous silos. We laughed at how our younger selves would have rolled their eyes at us fangirling over home decor, but there is joy in discovering new passions at any age. Back at home, I continued working on the memory box for Charlotte. I wrote captions for each item, explaining why a particular stuffed bear mattered, or what Lucy had said the day she received her first bicycle. I included stories about Eddie's early mornings with her on his lap, watching cartoons while he laced his boots. I wanted Charlotte to know that her mother had been loved fiercely, that she was not simply the antagonist in my tale. I also started exploring my own creativity beyond quilting. I bought watercolors and tried my hand at painting. My first attempts were messy, but the act of swishing the brush in water, mixing colors, and letting shapes emerge freed something inside me. Patchwork often watched from the porch, tilting his head as if critiquing my technique. I laughed and told him art is subjective. During one painting session, Lucy called and asked if she could borrow my truck. She had sold Bradley's car in the divorce and needed to move a piece of furniture. I hesitated but agreed, setting clear terms. She would pick up the keys, return with a full tank, and not bring up money. She complied. When she brought the truck back, she handed me a bouquet of sunflowers and a note that read, "Thank you for trusting me. Small steps, but steps nonetheless." Patchwork began showing signs of arthritis, limping slightly after long walks. I took him to the vet who prescribed medication and advised shorter walks. Caring for him reminded me of caring for Eddie in his later years, and I marveled at how nurturing someone or something else often helps heal your own wounds. The routine of pill pockets and gentle massages became another act of quiet love that filled the space Lucy once occupied. In December, as the holidays approached again, Lucy invited me and Patchwork to join her and Charlotte in baking cookies at her house. I agreed. Stepping into her kitchen for the first time in over a year felt strange. The counters were new, granite instead of laminate, likely purchased before their financial crash. The air smelled of vanilla and ginger. We mixed dough, rolled it out, cut shapes, and decorated them with colored sugar. Charlotte's joy was infectious. She smeared icing on my nose, and we laughed. At one point, Lucy paused, looked at me, and said, "I'm glad you're here." I responded, "Me too." That evening, I drove home with a tin of cookies and a heart full of conflicting emotions. We were inching toward reconciliation, but I still guarded my boundaries. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly like stacking blocks on uneven ground. I reminded myself that I could enjoy these moments without forgetting the lessons of the past year. Over the winter, my quilting class decided to make a group project, a quilt to donate to the Children's Hospital. Each of us sewed a square. Mine featured a small house with a bright yellow door and a garden out front. Stitching those details, I thought about my own house, the battles fought within its walls, and the peace that now permeated its rooms. Delivering the quilt to the hospital and seeing the parents' grateful smiles reinforced that giving does more than any inheritance ever could. In early spring, I attended a probate court hearing to support a friend from my walking group. Her nephew was contesting her will, claiming she was incompetent. Sitting in the courtroom, smelling the polished wood and hearing the judge's gavel, reminded me of how close I had come to being in her seat. The judge ruled in her favor, citing her detailed documentation. We celebrated over lunch afterward, toasting with iced tea and sharing a knowing look. Preparation matters. I found joy in small routines, brewing coffee in my new pot, watching the local news while folding laundry, tending to the basil plant on my windowsill, writing in my gratitude journal before bed. Each of these acts became a brick in the foundation of a life rebuilt on my own terms. Even the act of paying utility bills felt different because I knew the money being spent served me, not those waiting like vultures. As the second anniversary of the overheard conversation approached, I felt a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness for what was lost, pride for how far I had come. I reread the entries in my notebook from that first week and marveled at the woman who meticulously logged every conversation and purchase. She had been scared but determined. She had become me now, a woman with firmer boundaries and softer edges. In conversations with Maria and Denise, we often joked about writing a guidebook for women like us. Our working title was How to Keep Your Wallet and Your Sanity When Your Kids Lose Theirs. We laughed, but the idea held merit. Maybe one day we would hold workshops at the community center, sharing our stories and strategies. Turning pain into purpose felt like the final stage of healing. One rainy afternoon, I sat at my table with a cup of chamomile tea and looked at my will and trust documents. I reviewed the names, the clauses, and the signatures. I imagined Charlotte at 25 opening the letter in the memory box. I hoped she would see me not as spiteful, but as someone who refused to be used. I hoped she would understand that love sometimes looks like a firm no. In the same folder, I kept a copy of a poem I had written late one night. I am not your wallet. I am not your plan. I am a woman with stories and flour on my hands. Writing that poem felt like reclaiming the narrative in a lyrical way. Sometimes I read it aloud to Patchwork or to the mirror. It always made me smile. Another aspect of my healing was reconnecting with my body. In addition to yoga, I began attending a senior strength class at the gym. Lifting light weights and feeling my muscles engage reminded me that I was still strong. The instructor, a bubbly woman named Tara, cheered us on and reminded us to drink water. After class, we'd sit in the lobby and chat about grandchildren, aches, and hopes. Those conversations often circled back to the theme of self-respect. One day, Tara mentioned that she had just finished paying off her student loans in her 50s. I congratulated her. She said, "We all have our burdens, but we don't have to carry others without consent." That sentence struck me. It encapsulated what I'd learned. I don't have to carry Lucy and Bradley's poor decisions on my back. I can offer support without being a mule for someone else's load. In late spring, I decided to treat myself to a small remodel in my bathroom. I hired a local contractor who recommended a walk-in tub with a built-in seat. The installation process was messy with dust and noise, but the result was worth it. Each time I soaked in that tub with lavender bath salts, I felt like a queen in her castle. Self-care can be as practical as it is luxurious. Lucy visited during the remodel and admired the new tub. She laughed and said maybe she would sneak in after I fell asleep. I smiled and said, "You'll have to schedule an appointment. The joking tone masked a seriousness. My things, my rules. She nodded, understanding the subtext. We had reached a point where boundaries could be communicated with humor rather than anger. At the end of June, a young woman named Kendra joined our walking group. She was 40 and caring for her mother with dementia. Hearing her talk about the stress and love involved reminded me of my years caring for Eddie after his heart attack. I shared tips about balancing self-care and caregiving, and she listened intently. Passing on wisdom felt like paying forward the support I had received. I also took a weekend writing retreat hosted at a bed and breakfast outside of Austin. We spent our days writing prompts and evenings sharing around a fire pit. Under the stars, I read a piece about the day I heard Lucy and Bradley plotting. The group listened. Then one woman said, "Your story will save someone else from doubt." I believed her. We toasted marshmallows and shared secrets. Vulnerability creates community. During this retreat, I realized that storytelling had become part of my healing. My letter to Charlotte was long enough to be a book. My journal was full. I considered creating a video version of my story, maybe reading portions aloud. I thought about Grace's stories and how listening to others gave me courage. Perhaps my voice could give someone else courage. The idea percolated like coffee on a Sunday morning. As fall approached again, Lucy and I planned another picnic, this time including some of her friends and their children. We set up at a different park, bringing board games and a portable grill. The atmosphere was lighter. We shared recipes and laughed about trivial things. There was no mention of money. At one point, Lucy took a phone call away from the group. I overheard her saying, "No, I don't want to co-sign." She hung up and looked at me. We shared a knowing smile. Perhaps my lessons had rubbed off. I watched as Charlotte helped a younger child climb the jungle gym, her hands steady and her eyes kind. Pride swelled in my chest. Whatever happened between Lucy and me, I had helped raise a granddaughter who cared for others. That alone made all the pain worth enduring. During the holiday season, Lucy invited me to attend Charlotte's school play. She was a snowflake in a Winter Wonderland production. I sat in the audience with other parents and grandparents, the smell of paper programs and the rustle of coats filling the auditorium. When Charlotte spotted me and waved, my heart burst. After the show, Lucy and I posed for a photo with her. I printed it later and placed it in the front of the memory box, captioning it, "A New Beginning." As I added that photo, I realized that my life had grown so far beyond the initial betrayal that sparked my revenge. I had built a community, learned new skills, deepened my faith, and created a legacy that wasn't measured in dollars, but in stories, letters, quilts, and moments. I had become a woman I admired, not because of the vengeance I enacted, but because of the life I reclaimed. Even though I had spent every penny that Lucy and Bradley once coveted, I didn't feel impoverished. I felt abundant. My house felt full of laughter, dog hair, fabric scraps, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. My days were busy with volunteering, classes, visits with friends, and the occasional quiet afternoon nap with patchwork at my side. There was no room for bitterness because joy and purpose had taken up residence. The final open loop is whether Lucy and I will ever truly reconcile. I don't know. I hope we can salvage something, but I also accept that some wounds scar. I know that Charlotte will one day read my letter and perhaps understand. I hope she will see me as a woman who loved fiercely, who refused to be reduced to a dollar sign, and who spent her twilight years reclaiming her dignity. If you have ever been in my shoes, If you have felt discarded by those you love most, know that you are not alone. There is a path through the pain that does not require bitterness. It requires planning, courage, and a willingness to prioritize your own well-being. As I finish this script, I invite you to leave a comment below about what you would have done in my shoes, and to let me know where you're listening from, because hearing your stories and your city names creates a community of resilient souls who understand that revenge can be as simple as living well.